Lee Too Deep. Hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. James has been unable to contact Too Deep. A mysterious disappearance. Investigators are actively investigating. Is Too Deep's disappearance related to James' secretary? A series of questions are raised. Today we will follow along. The phone never rang again. Rain poured relentlessly outside James's glass-walled office, falling like threads of sorrow, cold and constant. The city buzzed beyond the windows, taxis honking, lights flickering, but inside, time stood still. James's fingers trembled as he typed her name into the screen again. Too Deep. Another failed call. 48 hours. That's how long it had been since her last message. The moon was beautiful tonight. And then, silence. No texts. No calls. No social media activity. It was as if the woman who once messaged just to share fleeting moments of beauty had been erased. James had faced lawsuits, corporate betrayals, even financial collapse. But this was raw, personal fear. Too Deep wasn't just someone he cared about. She was his calm in the storm. A quiet strength wrapped in a warm smile. A farm girl who had walked into his world like a whisper of peace, and vanished without a trace. He visited her apartment. Empty. Asked her neighbors. Blank stares. Hospitals? Nothing. Police? No records. Even her phone, offline. Untraceable. People don't just disappear. Not unless someone made sure of it. Trang, his longtime secretary, sat at her desk as usual. Calm and collected. 10 years of loyal service. Always professional. Always precise. But now, something was off. Her eyes never met his when he mentioned Too Deep. His office call logs, mysteriously wiped. The last GPS ping from Deep's phone, near an apartment she'd never been to before. Trang's apartment. Was he paranoid? Or had he finally noticed what was always there, the quiet obsession hidden behind perfect poise? James activated his private investigator, a man he only called when lives, not profits, were at stake. He would tear his empire apart brick by brick to find her. 2 nights later, James stood before Trang's apartment door. His heart beat like war drums. The investigator confirmed it. Deep's phone rang its final call from here. The hallway smelled of lilies and faint perfume. Serene. Sterile. He raised his hand to knock. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, meticulous order. Everything white and framed. But what froze him wasn't the furniture, it was a scarf, folded neatly on the sofa. Her scarf. A unique one he'd gifted Deep during their winter trip to Lot. And then, a soft gasp from the bedroom. James rushed in. Too Deep lay on the floor, hands bound, her eyes wide with fear, but alive. Bruised, but not broken. James, she whispered, tears streaking down her face. I knew you'd come. She tried to explain. Trang had taken her phone. Knew everything about them. Every move. Every habit. Before James could respond, a cold voice sliced through the air. I always knew this moment would come. Trang stood by the door. Calm. Smiling. She didn't raise the gun in her hand. She didn't need to. I served you for a decade, she said softly. I watched you grow. I gave you everything. And then I watched you give everything else to her. James stepped between her and Deep. She belongs with me, he said firmly. She never even saw me. Trang replied, her voice trembling. Not once. Not the way you looked at her. Silence. Then James spoke. Voice low and steady. You don't hurt what you love. You protect it. And you failed that test. Trang's hand shook. The gun slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from anger, but from heartbreak. She never looked at me the way she looks at you, Trang whispered. I just wanted to be your reason. Police arrived minutes later. Trang didn't resist. She confessed everything, the stalking, the kidnapping, the erased logs, even removing Too Deep's job application months ago, trying to delete her from James's orbit. As officers led her away, she She looked at Too Deep one last time. One day, he'll forget you, she murmured. The way he forgot me. But James never would. Weeks passed. James and Too Deep sat side by side on the wooden bench by the river, the place of their first kiss. The company was slowly recovering. But none of that mattered. What mattered was, she was safe. They were together. She found me Too Deep. Deep whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. You never stopped searching, he replied. And I never will. She smiled, a little shaky, but full of dawnlight. Because love isn't just about finding someone, it's about never losing them. No matter how hard the world tries to pull them away. The trial was swift. Public attention flared. Headlines screamed. But inside the courtroom, it was quieter, heavier. Too Deep sat silently beside James, her hand gripping his. She hadn't said much since her rescue. Some wounds don't bleed, they echo. Trang entered in handcuffs, thinner, hollow. When called to testify, she stood tall. I did it for love, she said flatly. But love without respect is obsession. I destroyed the very thing I wanted to protect. The judge nodded. 7 years. As she was escorted away, she paused at the door, glancing at James. I'm sorry, she whispered. But something in her eyes said, this isn't over. Back in his office weeks later, James turned on Trang's wiped computer, now company property. He recovered the hard drive. Inside a hidden folder, Echo_0412, hundreds of recordings. Not of him or Deep, but others. Phone calls, surveillance, obsessions immortalized in data. James listened in silence. Outside, life moved on. But inside, it felt as if time stopped. Again, Too Deep tried to live normally. She planted herbs on the balcony, played soft piano notes at night, laughed when James mixed up groceries. But some nights, thunder struck, and she awoke gasping, clutching his shirt like a lost child. James held her tight. I should have protected you, he whispered one evening, brushing his fingers over faded bruises. You found me, she replied softly. That's what saved me. Yet James couldn't forget Trang's face, not in anger, but in sorrow. The loyalty that turned into obsession, the danger that grew in silence. Sometimes, he wondered if he'd seen it coming, and simply looked away. Too Deep sat by the window one rainy night, knees drawn to her chest. I used to be brave, she whispered. You still are, James said. I try, she replied. She looked at her reflection in the glass, unsure of who she was now. Not a victim, not quite healed, but surviving. In that room, chained, I kept thinking about you, she said quietly. Not about Trang, but me. Was it my fault for letting her in? James took her hand. No, he said. You showed kindness. You turned it into something she twisted. That's not your burden. His eyes glistened. Not with pain, but with something deeper. Forgiveness. This story teaches us something fundamental. Betrayal doesn't come from enemies, it comes from those we trust. And sometimes, the strongest people aren't the ones who survive the storm, but the ones who choose to return, even after being lost in the dark. Love is not always loud. Sometimes, it's just sitting in silence with someone, listening without fixing, holding on when they whisper that everything is falling apart. The greatest healing doesn't come from forgetting what broke us, but from facing it together. Because true love doesn't just survive the storm, it learns how to dance in the rain.